Welcome back to Dr. Finance. This is a paper by Arthur Lewis in 1954, part 4. The open economy. When capital accumulation catches up with the labor supply, wages begin to rise above the subsistence level, and the capitalist surplus is adversely affected. However, if there is still surplus labor in other countries, the capitalists can avoid this in one of two ways: by encouraging immigration or by exporting their capital to countries where there is still abundant labor at the subsistence wage. We must examine each of these in turn. Let us first clear out of the way the effects of the immigration of skilled workers, since our main concern is with an abundant immigration of unskilled workers released by the subsistence sectors of other countries. It is theoretically possible that the immigration of skilled workers may reduce the demand for the services of native unskilled workers, but this is most unlikely. More probably, it will make possible new investments and industries which were not possible before, and will thus increase the demand for all kinds of labor relatively to its supply. We must also get out of the way relatively small immigrations. If 100,000 Puerto Ricans immigrate to the United States every year, the effect on United States wage is negligible. US wages are not pulled down to the Puerto Rican level. It is Puerto Rican wages which are then pulled up to the United States level. Mass immigration is quite a different kettle of fish. If there were free immigration from India and China to the United States, the wage level of the United States would certainly be pulled down towards the Indian and Chinese levels. In fact, in a competitive model, the US wage could exceed the Asian wage only by an amount covering migration costs plus the cliff to which we have already referred. The result is the same whether one assumes increasing or diminishing returns to labor. Wages are constant at subsistence level plus. All the benefit of increasing returns goes into the capitalist surplus. This is one of the reasons why in every country where the wage level is relatively high, the trade unions are bitterly hostile to immigration, except of people in special categories, and take steps to have it restricted. The result is that real wages are higher than they would otherwise be, while profits, capitalist resources, and total output are smaller than they would otherwise be. The export of capital is therefore a much easier way out for the capitalist, since trade unions are quick to restrict immigration but much slower in bringing the export of capital under control. The effect of exporting capital is to reduce the creation of fixed capital at home, and therefore to reduce the demand for labor. Labor will still be required to create the capital, e.g., to make machines for export, but domestic labor will no longer be required to work with the capital, as it would also be if the capital were invested at home. This, however, is only one side of the picture, for the capital may be used in foreign countries in ways which raise the standard of living of the capital exporting country, and so offset wholly or partially the first effect, or in ways which lower it, thus aggravating the first effect. The result depends on the type of competition which there is between the capital exporting and the capital importing countries. Let us assume to begin with that there is no competition and even no trade. Both countries are self-sufficient. Wages, however, are rising in country A while labor is abundant in country B. A's capitalists therefore invest their capital in B. Trade returns show first the export surplus from A representing the transfer of capital and later the import surplus representing the return home of dividend. There is no effect on the workers in A other than that their wages cease to rise as they would have been if the capital were invested instead at home. If A's resources and B's resources are exactly the same, wages cannot rise in A until capital accumulation in B has wiped out B's labor surplus. Now, in the real world, the resources of two countries are not exactly alike, and it cannot be taken for granted that it will be more profitable to invest in B if profits are falling in A, which also cannot be taken for granted. The profitability of investing in a country depends upon its natural resources, upon its human material, and upon the amount of capital already invested there. The most productive investments are those which are made to open up rich, easily accessible natural resources such as fertile soil, ores, coal, or oil. This is the principal reason why most of the capital exported in the last 100 years went to the Americas as to Australia rather than to India or to China, where the known resources were already being used. In the well-developed parts of the world, in the resource sense, the main opportunity for productive investment lies in improving techniques. These countries are well, even overdeveloped in the resources sense, but underdeveloped in their techniques. It is profitable to use capital to introduce new techniques. But this is not as profitable as using capital to make available both new techniques and also new resources. This also explains why the United Kingdom rapidly became a capital exporting country. The limits of its natural resources were soon reached, whereas the United States is very late in reaching this stage, since its natural resources are so extensive that capital investment at home is still very profitable, even though wages are very high. Productivity depends also on the human material. Even though the genetic composition of peoples may be much the same, as far as potential productivity may be concerned, their cultural inheritance is very different. Differences in literacy, forms of government, attitudes to work, and social relations generally may make a big difference to productivity. Capitalists naturally find it more profitable and safer to invest in countries where the atmosphere is capitalist than they do in widely different cultures. But this is not all. The productivity of investment in B depends not only upon B's natural resources, but its human institutions, but also upon the efficiency of all other industries whose services the new investment would require to use. This depends partly upon how highly capitalized these other industries are. The productivity of one investment depends upon other investments having been made before. Since it may be more profitable to invest capital in countries which already have a lot of capital than to invest it in a new country. If this were always so, no capital would be exported and the gap between wages in the surplus labor and the non-surplus countries would not diminish but would widen. In practice, capital export is small, and the gap does widen, and we cannot at all exclude the possibility that there is a natural tendency for capital to flow towards the capitalized and to shun the uncapitalized. If we could assume that there is a natural tendency for the rate of profit to fall in a closed economy, we could say that however low the rate may be in other countries, the rate in the closed economy must ultimately fall towards the level elsewhere, after which capital export must begin. Practically, all the best known economists of every school in every century have affirmed that such a tendency exists, though their reasons have varied widely. The most notable exception is Marshall, who gave the right answer, which is that increasing capital per head tends to lower the yield of capital, while increasing technical knowledge tends to raise it. Thus, said Marshall, the yield fell from 10% in the Middle Ages to 3% in the middle of the 18th century. A long period of slow technical growth, after which the decline was arrested by the great increase in opportunities for using capital. This being so, the natural tendency for the yield of capital to fall is nothing but a popular myth. The yield may fall or it may not. We cannot foretell. We get a different answer, however, if we turn from the rate of profit on capital in general to the rate in particular lines of investment. In any particular line, the possibilities of further expansion are soon exhausted, or at any rate greatly reduced. All industries develop on a logistic pattern, growing fairly slowly at first, then rapidly, and later on growing again quite slowly. Hence, the investors in any particular line sooner or later come to a point where there is not much more scope for investment in that line at home. It is open to them to put their accumulating profits into quite different industries. But there is also the temptation to stick to the field in which they have specialized knowledge and to use their profits to take the industry into new countries. What brings about the exportation of capital is not inevitably falling home profits or rising wages at home, but simply the fact that foreign countries having different resources unutilized in different degrees, there are some profitable opportunities for investment abroad. This is not even dependent on capital accumulation having caught up with surplus labor at home. For even if there is still surplus labor at home available at subsistence wages, investment opportunities abroad may be more profitable. Many capitalists residing in surplus labor countries invest their capital in England or the United States. We must therefore beware of saying that a country will begin to export capital as soon as capital accumulation at home catches up with labor supply. All the same, countries do export capital, and we can say that if labor is scarce in those countries, the effect is to reduce the demand for labor in those countries and thus to prevent wages from rising as much as they otherwise would. Let us now assume that the two countries do not compete, but trade with each other. There are two variants of this case. One where the two countries produce only one good, but a different good in each. Here, wage rate levels are not determined in relation to each other. In the second case, each country produces two or more goods, one of which is common to both, and is the good produced in the subsistence sector. Suppose that in the first case, country A produces wheat and country B produces peanuts. Relative prices are determined solely by supply and demand. Assume that a capitalist sector develops in A, applying new techniques to wheat production. At first, it may get unlimited labor at an average wage in wheat related to average subsistence wheat production. In due course, however, the surplus is eliminated and wheat wages start to rise. If the capitalist techniques which fructified wheat production are equally applicable to peanuts, it will pay to export capital to B, where unlimited labor is available at a wage related to average subsistence output of peanuts. As in the case discussed before, wages in A will be held down by the profitability of investing capital in B. A new element, however, enters into consideration because of the effects of investment on the terms of trade. When capital is being invested in A and raising the output of wheat, the price of peanuts will rise relatively. Hence, the capitalist workers in A as well as subsistence workers in A will be worse off in terms of peanuts, though earning of the same real wage in wheat. The workers in B will be better off in terms of wheat while earning the same in peanuts. When capital is invested in B, the opposite happens. The terms of trade are moved against the B workers in favor of the A workers. The moral is that capital export may benefit the workers on balance if it is applied to increasing the supply of things they import. For example, in the Britain of 1850, exclusive investment at home in the cotton industry, while tending to raise wages, might also still more have depressed the terms of trade against the cotton industry. When we pass to the second case, the result is the same, except that the terms of trade are now determinate. Assume that both countries produce food but do not trade in it. Country A also produces steel and country B also produces rubber. If B can release unlimited supplies of labor from subsistence food production, wages in B will equal average, not marginal, product in food, abstracting from the difference between subsistence and capitalist wages. In A also, the wage cannot fall below productivity in the food industry. We may simplify by assuming in the first instance that labor is the sole factor of production and that 1 day's labor in A produces 3 food or 3 steel. In B produces 1 food or 1 rubber. Earnings in A will then be 3 times earnings in B. The difference in food productivity and the rate of exchange will be 1 food equals 1 steel equals 1 rubber. Suppose now that productivity increases in B's rubber industry only, so that 1 day's labor produces instead 3 rubber. This is excellent for the workers in A, since 1 steel will now buy 3 rubber, but it will do the workers in B no good whatsoever, except insofar as they purchase rubber, since their wage will continue to be one food. If, on the other hand, the subsistence economy became more productive, wages would rise correspondingly. Suppose that one day's labor in B now produces 3 food or 1 rubber. Wages would be as high in B as in A, and the price of rubber would now be 1 rubber equals 3 steel. Workers in A are benefited if productivity in B increases in what they buy, and are worse off if productivity in B increases in B's subsistence sector. Workers in B are benefited only if productivity increases in their subsistence sector. All other increases in productivity are lost in the terms of trade. We have here the key to the question why tropical produce is so cheap. Take, for example, the case of sugar. This is an industry in which productivity is extremely high by any biological standard. It is also an industry in which output per acre has about trebled over the course of the last 75 years. A rate of growth of productivity which is unparalleled by any other major industry in the world. Certainly not by wheat industry. Nevertheless, workers in the sugar industry continue to walk barefooted and to live in shacks, while workers in wheat enjoy among the highest living standards in the world. The reason is that wages in the sugar industry are related to the fact that the subsistence sector of tropical economies are able to release however many workers the sugar industry may want, at wages which are low because tropical food production per head is low. However vastly productive the sugar industry may become, the benefit accrues chiefly to industrial purchasers in the form of lower prices for sugar. The capitalists who invest in sugar do not come into the argument because their earnings are determined not by productivity in sugar, but by the general rate of profit on capital. This is why our leaving capital out of this and the subsequent analysis of the effects of changing productivity upon wages and the terms of trade simplifies the analysis without significantly affecting its results. To raise the price of sugar, you must increase the productivity of the tropical subsistence food economies. Now, the contribution of the temperate world to the tropical world, whether in capital or in knowledge, has in the main been defined through the commercial crops for export, where the benefit mainly accrues to the temperate world in lower prices. The prices of tropical commercial crops will always permit only subsistence wages until, for a change, capital and knowledge are put at the disposal of the subsistence producers to increase the productivity of tropical food production for home consumption. The analysis applies to all tropical commercial products of which an unlimited supply can be produced because unlimited natural resources exist in relation to demand. For example, land of suitable quality. It does not apply where natural resources of a particular kind are scarce. For example, the lands suitable for cultivating sugar or peanuts are very extensive, but mineral-bearing lands or lands with just the right suitability for cocoa are relatively scarce. Hence, the price of a mineral or of cocoa may rise to any level consistent with demand. If the lands are owned by capitalists employing workers, this will make little difference to their wages. But if these scarce lands are owned by peasants, the peasants may of course become rich. In general, the peasants have got little out of their mineral-bearing lands, especially when these have been expropriated by imperial governments or declared to be crown property and sold to foreign capitalists for a song. Cocoa is the only case, a doubtful one, where it seems that a world scarcity of suitable land may now permanently bring to the peasants earning higher than they could obtain from subsistence food production. This is not to say that the tropical countries gain nothing from having foreign capital invested in commercial production for export. They gain an additional source of employment and of taxation. The accumulation of fixed capital in their midst also brings nearer the day when the demand for labor will catch up with the supply. Though even this will not raise wages in any one tropical country until they start to rise in all. Since capital would otherwise merely transfer itself to the countries where there is still a surplus. What they do not gain is rising real wages. The whole benefit of increasing productivity in the commercial sector goes to the foreign consumer, at least in the early stages. In the latest stages, they may also gain if their peasants imitate the capitalist techniques so that subsistence productivity rises, or if the continual increase in the output of commercial crops moves the terms of trade in favor of subsistence food production. Either of these changes would react upon real wages, but would do so effectively only when the changes have extended throughout the tropical world. In the next case, we assume that the two countries can produce the same things and trade with each other. A is the country where labor is scarce. B, the country where unlimited labor is available in the subsistence food sector. Using the classical framework for the law of comparative costs, we write that 1 day's labor in A produces 3 food or 3 cotton manufactures, in B produces 2 food or 1 cotton manufactures. This, of course, gives the wrong answer to the question who should specialize in which, since we have written the average instead of the marginal products. We can assume that these coincide in A and also in cotton manufacture in B. Then we should write in marginal terms. A produces 3 foods or 3 cotton manufactures, and B produces 0 food or 1 cotton manufactures. B should specialize in cotton manufacture and import food. In practice, however, wages will be 2 food in B and between 3 food and 6 food in A, at which levels it will be cheaper for B to export food and import cotton. This divergence between the actual and what it ought to be is the most serious difference which the existence of surplus labor makes to the neoclassical theory of international trade. It has caught out many economists who have wrongly advised underdeveloped countries on the basis of current money costs, instead of lifting the veil to see what lies beneath. It has also caught out many countries which have allowed or been forced to allow their industries to be destroyed by cheap foreign imports. With the sole effect of increasing the size of the labor surplus. When the national income would have been increased if the domestic industries had instead been protected against imports. The fault is not that of the law of comparative costs, which remains valid if written in real marginal terms, but of those who have forgotten that money costs are entirely misleading in economies where there is surplus labor at the ruling wage. Of course, if labor is a free good, but the two industries use some scarce resources, such as land or capital, the comparison has to be made not in terms of labor cost, but in terms of the scarce resource. Thus, even though labor is unemployed, it may be more economic to use capital to increase the production of food than to use it in creating new manufacturing industries. Adam Smith was, as usual, on the ball. This was the substance of his argument that a tariff could not raise the national income even if it increased employment, since it would simply be diverting capital from more to less productive uses. The Keynesian model doesn't help, since it assumes unlimited capital as well as unemployment. All the same, there may be cases where it is more economic to use capital to create new industries rather than to fructify old ones, and where this is nevertheless not the most profitable thing to do in the financial sense, because labor has to be paid a wage when its marginal productivity is really zero. Moreover, many manufacturing activities do not in fact use any other scarce resource but labor. The handicraft and cottage industries especially, which may provide employment for up to 10% of the people in backward countries, use no capital resources to speak of. Yet, these are the very first industries to be destroyed by cheap imports of manufactures, e.g., the havoc wrought to the Indian cotton industry in the first half of the 19th century. The law of comparative cost, rightly applied, enables us to predict the pattern of international trade. We can say that those countries which have inadequate agricultural resources in relation to their populations, for example, India, Japan, Egypt, Great Britain, Jamaica, must live by importing agricultural products and importing manufacturers. Metal manufacturers, if they have the coal and ores, India, Great Britain, and light manufacturers if they have not, Japan, Egypt, Jamaica. Correspondingly, countries which are rich in agricultural land, United States and Argentina, should be net exporters of agricultural products at relatively good terms of trade. Currently, this pattern is distorted by the divergence between money and real costs. But if world population continues to grow at its current rate, this pattern must emerge in due course unless there are revolutionary developments in agricultural science. Let us, however, continue to examine this case, assuming that no distortion is taking place. As before, A is developed while B has surplus labor in food. Suppose that one day's labor in A produces 5 food or 5 cotton manufacturers. In B produces 1 food or 1 cotton manufacturers average. B ought to specialize in cotton and will actually do so. Wages and producers are determinate. The wage in B will be 1 food. The price of cotton will be 1 cotton equals 1/3 food. The wage in A will be 5 food, and A will get all the benefits of the exchange. Suppose now that productivity increases in B's cotton industry. B's wage is unchanged and the whole benefit accrues to A. But if productivity increases in B's food industry, the average rising, say, from 1 to 2, B's wage will rise from 1 food to 2 food. A's wage will still be 5 food, but cotton will now be dearer. 1 cotton equals 2/3 food. To the advantage of B and disadvantage of A, B's wage determinate because there is unlimited labor available at a subsistence wage, and all the benefit of the exchange goes to A because B is producing both commodities. It is time to say that a word about the effect of increasing the subsistence productivity in countries with surplus labor. The analysis is the same as we made for the closed economy, pages 431 to 5, except that we must now think of the world as a whole as the closed economy. We must also think of the commercial sector of these economies as being a part of the world capitalist sector. Then, if the world capitalist sector is not dependent on the peasants for food, even to feed its plantation and mining laborers in the surplus countries, an increase in the productivity of the peasants must raise wages against the capitalists. To have this effect, however, productivity must rise in all these countries. Otherwise, the capitalists will simply transfer from those countries where subsistence productivity has risen to those where it has not. If, on the other hand, we assume that the capitalists need the peasants' food and that the demand for food is inelastic, then increased productivity reduces the price of food even more, and so reduces the share of capitalist workers in the capitalist product. This again assumes that the changes are worldwide. If one country raises its productivity, the price of food will not fall. Wages will rise in that country and capitalists will move elsewhere. However, if the price of food falls, the peasants eat most of their output and will still be better off. For example, suppose a peasant produces 100 food, eats 80 food, and sells 20 food for 20 manufacturers. Suppose now that this productivity increases to 200, reducing the price of food by more than half, say to 0.4. The peasant can now have 30 manufacturers costing 75 food and still eat 125 food instead of 80. The standard of living in the surplus countries is thus raised nearer to that of the advanced countries. But the terms of the trade move against both the food and the commercial products of the surplus countries. Would move in favor of the commercial product if the elasticity of demand for food were 1.0 or more. In practice, food production in tropical countries with surplus labor is only a small part of world food production. Asia and Africa together produce less than 20% of the world's food. Hence, increase in food productivity in the tropics would not reduce the price of food, pari passu. Real wages would therefore rise and the terms of trade would move in favor of tropical commercial products. This would hurt labor in the industrial countries insofar as it was buying such products and benefited insofar as tropical countries were competing in industrial production. This brings us finally to the case where the two countries A and B produce competing goods, to sell in third markets. This need not detain us long. If capital is exported in ways which raise subsistence productivity in the capital importing country, the workers in the capital exporting country will benefit, since the wages of their rivals will be raised. If, however, it is exported to increase productivity in the exporting sector of the capital importing country, the workers in the capital exporting country will be doubly hit. First by the reduced capital accumulation at home, and then again by the fall in their rivals' prices. We may conclude as follows. Capital export tends to reduce wages in capital exporting countries. This is wholly or partly offset if the capital is applied to cheapening the things which the workers import, or to raising wage costs in countries which compete in the third markets by raising productivity in their subsistence sector. The reduction in wages is, however, aggravated if the capital is invested in ways which raise the cost of imports, increasing productivity in subsistence sectors, or which increase the productivity of competing exports. We have also seen that capital importing countries with surplus labor do not gain an increase in real wages from having foreign capital invested in them, unless this capital results in increased productivity in the commodities they produce for their own consumption. Summary. We may summarize the article as follows. 1. In many economies, an unlimited supply of labor is available at a subsistence wage. This was the classical model. The neoclassical model, including the Keynesian, when applied to such economies, gives erroneous results. 2. The main sources from which workers come as economic development proceeds are subsistence agriculture, casual labor, petty trade, domestic service, wives and daughters in the household, and the increase of population. In most, but not all of these sectors, if the country is overpopulated relatively to its natural resources, the marginal productivity of labor is negligible, zero, or even negative. The subsistence wage at which this surplus labor is available for employment may be determined by a conventional view of the minimum required for subsistence, or it may be equal to the average products per man in subsistence agriculture plus a margin. 4. In such an economy, employment expands in a capitalist sector as capital formation occurs. 5. Capital formation and technical progress results not in raising wages, but in raising the share of profits in the national income. 6. The reason why savings are low in an undeveloped economy relatively to national income is not that the people are poor, but that capitalist profits are low relatively to national income. As the capitalist sector expands, profits grow relatively, and an increasing proportion of national income is reinvested. 7. Capital is formed not only out of profits, but also out of credit creation. The real cost of capital created by inflation is zero in this model, and this capital is just as useful as what is created in more respectable fashion, i.e., out of profits. 8. Inflation for the purpose of getting hold of resources for war may be cumulative, but inflation for the purpose of creating productive capital is self-destructive. Prices rise as the capital is created and fall again as its output reaches the market. 9. The capitalist sector cannot expand in these ways indefinitely, since capital accumulation can proceed faster than population can grow. When the surplus is exhausted, wages begin to rise above the subsistence level. 10. The country is still, however, surrounded by other countries which have surplus labor. Accordingly, as soon as its wages begin to rise, mass immigration and the export of capital operate to check the rise. 11. Mass immigration of unskilled labor might even raise output per head, but its effect would be to keep wages in all countries near the subsistence level of the poorest countries. 12. The export of capital reduces capital formation at home, and so keeps wages down. This is offset if the capital export cheapens the things which workers import or raises wage costs in competing countries, but it is aggravated if the capital export raises the cost of imports or reduces costs in competing countries. 13. The importation of foreign capital does not raise real wages in countries which have surplus labor, unless the capital results in increased productivity in the commodities which they produce for their own consumption. 14. The main reason why tropical commercial produce is so cheap in terms of the standard of living it affords is the inefficiency of tropical food production per man. Practically, all the benefit of increasing efficiency in export industries goes to the foreign consumer, whereas raising efficiency in subsistence food production would automatically make commercial produce dearer. 15. The law of comparative costs is just as valid in countries with surplus labor as it is in others. But whereas in the latter it is a valid foundation of argument for free trade, in the former it is an equally valid foundation of arguments for